Let's turn our attention to the 7 panels in the QLab workspace. To give you a quick overview, here's the name and location of each panel. The toolbar, the Go On Deck Notes panel, the toolbox, the current queue list, the active queue panel, the queue list drawer, and the inspector panel. Here's a more detailed look at each one. The toolbar offers a convenient location for several workspace controls. As noted earlier, the very top of the toolbar displays the name of both the workspace and the current queue list. If you right-click on the toolbar, you'll be presented with the option to customize the toolbar with whichever tools you find most useful, as well as the ability to adjust the icon size. The Inspector, Toolbox, Active Queues, and Queue Lists buttons give you the opportunity to open or close each respective panel depending upon your working needs. Also note that the Inspector panel is resizable by dragging its border. The Load to Time slider is a great way to quickly get to a specific playback time within a queue or queue sequence. The Lock button does just what it says. It locks the workspace in its current form to avoid any accidental changes. There are other options in the toolbar, but most of them are self-explanatory, or you can find good descriptions of each in the QLab documentation file. I tend to keep the toolbar clear of anything that I can achieve with a keyboard shortcut. For instance, to open and close the workspace preferences, simply use the keyboard shortcut Command-. Another example of this is the Load command, which loads the currently selected queue sequence into RAM to make it available for instant playback. Select Q1401 in the tutorial workspace, press the L key, and notice that all of the queues in the queue sequence now have yellow dots in the first column, which means that they're now loaded into RAM and will play back instantly when Q1401 is triggered. This is an extremely useful feature, especially during the rehearsal process. I use it so often, in fact, that I constantly hit the L key rather than taking the extra time to mouse up to the toolbar load button. So I just take the buttons off the toolbar, which ultimately helps reinforce the use of keyboard shortcuts. The one exception to this is that I always keep the stop button available just in case someone needs it. It's very important to always keep the ability to stop your queue list easily accessible. The Go On Deck Notes panel is fairly self-explanatory. It contains the Go button for firing queues from the screen, shows you which queue is going to be triggered by the next Go, and has a space for displaying notes. Since you've already selected Q1401, you should see that 1401 honks is listed in the On Deck area, and a reminder message for the board operator is displayed in the Notes area. Right-clicking in the Notes area gives you the ability to change the font, and you can also drag pictures into the Notes area. The toolbox is where all of your available queue options are displayed. There are a number of different ways to add a queue to your current queue list. You can drag and drop the desired queue into your queue list, or you can insert a specific queue into the list by using the keyboard shortcut associated with the queue. The new queue will be placed directly after whichever queue is currently selected in the queue list. Notice that you can also change the order of the queues in the toolbox to keep your most frequently used queues near the top, where the keyboard shortcuts are an option. I use the group, audio, and fade queues most frequently, so I usually keep them right at the top of the toolbox. The current queue list is where you'll do most of your work in QLab. Each row in the list represents a specific queue, while the columns provide a quick way to display and modify common queue parameters. Q1401 should still be selected and loaded. Notice that Q1401 is a group queue that contains 5 audio queues and 1 fade queue that are programmed to fire as a single queue sequence. Before you fire the queue, let's take a look at what the current queue list is telling us about the way this queue sequence will actually play back. In the far left column of the current queue list, you'll see that we're given 2 pieces of information, the queue status and the queue type. As previously mentioned, the yellow dots displayed next to the 5 audio queues indicate that these queues are loaded into RAM and all ready to fire. When a queue is playing, the queue status will display a green triangle play indicator. The red X next to the fade queue at the end of the queue sequence indicates that there is a problem of some sort with this queue. It's called a broken queue, which basically means that the queue has incomplete or invalid settings and therefore cannot be played. Notice that a red X also appears in front of the group queue at the beginning of the queue sequence. This is so the user knows that there's a broken queue contained within the group, even if the group is collapsed. In this case, the problem is simply that the level settings for the fade queue have not been modified. So QLab is essentially telling us, hey, you know there's really no need for this fade queue unless you change something. However, a broken queue could also indicate a more serious problem, such as a missing audio file or a problem with the audio interface hardware. These are issues that are usually easily remedied, and the broken queue indicator just provides a warning before you actually try to play the queue. You'll also notice that the playback position indicator is located behind Q1401's red X, letting us know that Q1401 will be fired when the next go trigger is received. The icon to the right of the status is simply the Q type indicator, which is fairly self-explanatory. The next column contains the Q number. The keyboard shortcut to edit the Q number is by default N. Note that QLab will allow you to use any combination of numbers and letters for the Q number, but you can't enter the same Q number within the same workspace. And this includes the Q numbers on separate Q lists within a single workspace. QLab offers a number of features related to automatic numbering and renumbering, which we'll discuss later in the tutorial series. The Q name is the next column, and once again, it's fairly straightforward. This is where you can type in the name for the Q. The keyboard shortcut to edit the name of the selected Q is the letter Q. The next column displays the Q's target, which obviously leads us to a discussion of what exactly QLab means by the target of a Q. For audio and video cues, the target is the actual media file to which QLab is pointing when it's playing that specific cue. Any audio or video cue that doesn't have an associated target will appear as a broken cue. Other QLab cues, such as fade, go to, start, and disarm cues, will have another QLab cue as their target. Their function is intended to act upon the target QLab cue. For instance, a fade cue is used to adjust the levels of an audio cue to new level settings over a specified period of time. The audio cue that is having its levels adjusted is called the target of the fade cue. Q1403 provides an example of a fade cue which fades out its targeted audio cue over a period of 10 seconds. Assigning a target to a cue can be accomplished in a number of ways. The up arrow icon in the target column will open the target dialog window, or you can use the keyboard shortcut T to open the target dialog window for the currently selected cue. You can also drag and drop cues onto one another to assign targets, which we will discuss and demonstrate in the next tutorial. The last four columns are central to the programming of cue sequences. The pre-wait, action, and post-wait columns display timing and duration information and allow the user to adjust the timing of cues within a cue sequence relative to one another. Note that you can click on the gray icon next to each of these column labels to switch the display between time elapsed and time remaining. The final column displays the continue mode of the cue. Go ahead and hit the spacebar to go on Q1401 and just observe what is going on in the last four columns. The details of these four columns and how they work together will be explained in the next tutorial, Programming Basics. The Active Cue panel allows you to stop and start playback of individual cues within a currently running cue sequence. Play cues 1402 through 1404 and use the playback controls in the Active Cue panel to move to various locations within the cues. The Cue List drawer simply displays the cue lists that are available within the workspace, and selecting a cue list from the drawer will make that cue list the current cue list. Cue lists can be added or deleted with the plus and minus buttons at the top of the cue list drawer. Also notice that each cue list in the drawer can be collapsed or expanded to display all of the cues contained within that cue list. The Inspector panel is the location where parameters for each cue can be modified. Each cue type has its own unique parameters, but the first two Inspector tabs, Info and Triggers, are common to all cue types. We'll talk about Info and Triggers right now and discuss the other Inspector tabs in later tutorials. Note that you can easily move between the Inspector tabs by hitting the Command key along with the left and right arrow keys. Under the Info tab, the pre-wait, post-wait, and continue fields are simply a second access point to the parameters that are available in the current cue list. The color parameter allows you to change the background color of a cue, which can be useful for highlighting specific cues in your cue list. The armed parameter is a new addition to version 2 of QLab, which allows the user to essentially turn on and off a cue without deleting it from the list. It's a wonderful way to keep a couple of cue options readily available. Plus, because there are also arm and disarm cues, you can actually build arming and disarming into your cue list, which can be very useful, as you'll see in a moment when we discuss triggers. The Triggers tab provides a number of interesting options for triggering cues that are independent from the programmed order of the cue list. I'll demonstrate this important concept in a moment after we've talked about some of the triggering options. The first trigger option is the hotkey, which allows you to assign the trigger for the cue to a specific key on the QWERTY keyboard. This can be a very useful feature for creating backup cues. Cues 1405, G, and 1406 demonstrate this concept. Imagine that a performance involves an underscored scene in which one of the characters fires a handgun that is loaded with a blank round. If for some reason the blank doesn't go off, the playback operator is standing by to trigger sound cue G so that the scene doesn't look completely ridiculous. However, notice that the cue list is programmed to skip over sound cue G so that when the blank fires correctly during most performances, the playback operator can simply go back to hitting the spacebar to trigger the next cue, which fades out the underscore. Also notice that the arm and disarm cues are used to make cue G available only when it's needed. This is a handy programming technique for preventing any accidental triggering of the hotkey cue. The next trigger option is the MIDI message trigger. MIDI is a communication protocol typically used in the world of sound and recording equipment, but it's also very useful for controlling devices within the live production environment, such as audio mixing consoles and light boards. The MIDI message option allows you to trigger a cue using various standard MIDI messages. You can easily assign a MIDI trigger to a cue by using the capture function to automatically recognize the specific MIDI input. In the case of Q1407, a note on MIDI input was captured by enabling the capture function, pressing middle C on the MIDI keyboard, and then typing the word any into the velocity field so that the cue would respond to any velocity value of C4 as the trigger. Select Cue Eros and notice that in the Notes section there is an illustration of which cues will be triggered by pressing specific MIDI keyboard keys. If you have a MIDI keyboard hooked up to your computer, pressing these keys will play back the corresponding cue. And note that the disarm and arm cues are being used to restrict the playback of certain cues so that they happen at the correct time. I've done this not only to again demonstrate the use of the arm and disarm cues, but also to help guide you when playing back a series of sound cues that are meant to work together to create a specific piece of music. It's a method which I'll use throughout this tutorial series, and you should just hit go on the next cue once it becomes armed. As you play through cues 1407 to 1410, note that you can trigger them either with the MIDI keyboard or the standard Go trigger. However, there's an important distinction between the two methods that we need to discuss. Notice that if you start with cue 1407 and continue to fire the cues using the spacebar, the playback indicator will move through the cue list as you might expect. However, if you select Cue Eros again and then use the MIDI keyboard to trigger the cues will play, but the playback indicator does not advance with the cues. Just be aware of this behavior and use either method based upon the situation. For instance, in the case of cues 1407 to 1410, there's really no need to use MIDI triggers. These cues are designed to play back one after another, which is exactly what the standard Go triggering method is designed to accomplish. The second example of MIDI triggers, fight scene accents, is a much more appropriate use of MIDI triggers. Imagine a fight scene that is underscored with music and needs some extra oomph to help sell the intensity. Although most fight scenes are tightly choreographed, there may still be a need to have more flexibility with the order in which the sound cues play back. Using MIDI triggers will allow the playback operator to fire the go for the underscore, which automatically arms and loads all of the MIDI trigger sound cues. Then, during the fight, the playback operator has the flexibility to add the MIDI triggered cues in a way which closely matches the action. On the last hit of the fight, the board operator will hit the spacebar again to fire the go for the underscore button, which will also automatically disarm all of the MIDI triggers. This situation is much more suited to the use of MIDI triggers due to the extra flexibility required by the scene. The wall clock trigger is fairly self-explanatory, and is especially useful for installations in which multiple systems might need to be coordinated to fire cues at specific times. Experiment with the wall clock trigger by setting the trigger time for cue 1413 about 30 seconds later than the current time. The timecode trigger allows the triggering of cues at a specific timecode value, which offers frame-accurate synchronization of multiple devices. The use of timecode will be discussed in more detail later in this series.